By the time Barbara Ivanoff had pressed a folded linen cloth to Edmund Ashford's bleeding forehead, her own hands were shaking so violently she had to brace one palm against the schoolroom table to keep from swaying. Blood, though never much of it, always made the younger children cry in sympathy, and little Alice had already begun to whimper from the window seat, where she was meant to be conjugating Latin verbs. "It is nothing," Barbara said far more firmly than she felt. "A scrape, no more. Edmund, hold still. Alice, if you cry, you must cry quietly, and fetch me the clean bandages from the cupboard at once." The command steadied them all by giving each child something to do. Alice sprang up, sniffling. Edmund tried to look valiant and succeeded only in looking pale. Outside, rain skimmed the leaded glass in silver lines. Inside, the schoolroom smelled of chalk, damp wool, and the faint medicinal sting of lavender spirits. A moment later, Mrs. Tripp, the nursery maid, hurried in at Alice's frantic summons, took one look at Edmund, and clucked her tongue in that way servants did when they wished to imply that trouble had entered the house from outside. Barbara had become acquainted with the tone in 7 short days. "That plain foreign miss has got them climbing furniture now," the kitchen maid had whispered in the passage, on Barbara's second morning, not seeing her in the alcove. "Eyes like a painting, but plain all the same. Plain, foreign, miss." 3 labels pinned neatly where a woman's name ought to have been. Barbara had heard worse in Lady Kettering's London drawing-room, where pity and contempt were served with tea and petties 4s. She had learned to wear composure as other women wore jewels. Yet now, as she bound Edmund's forehead, and the child's small hand clutched her sleeve in trust, her composure thinned. She was 22 years old, penniless by appearance, and installed at Greythorn Abbey as governess to an earl's children, because there had been nowhere left to go that her stepmother's hand could not reach quickly. "Will Papa be angry?" Edmund asked, blinking through the sting of tears he had almost conquered. "Only if you bleed on your arithmetic," Barbara replied, "and only a little then." He gave a weak laugh. Alice giggled because Edmund did. Crisis for the moment passed. When she sent them to copy passages from Caesar while Mrs. Tripp fussed over clean stockings, Barbara crossed the room and gripped the edge of the oak table with both hands until the tremor left her fingers. She did not fear blood. She feared losing command of a room, of a life, of the thin line she had drawn between herself and the woman who had raised her as a possession to be traded. Lady Kettering had called it prudence when she diverted funds from Barbara's account to settle her own gaming debts, necessity when she sold off the last of Captain Ivanov's books, duty when she arranged an introduction between Barbara and Mr. Pelham, a widowed creditor old enough to have danced at Barbara's christening, and hinted that an obedient marriage would repair everyone's discomfort. Barbara had smiled through that tea. Then, at dawn, 2 days later, she had boarded the North coach under her own name and accepted the first respectable post that did not ask for a dowry. Greythorn Abbey had received her with polished floors, ancient portraits, and a silence that watched her. The Earl of Greythorn himself had been courteous in the way one is courteous to weather, acknowledgement without intimacy. Lord Julian Ashford was not handsome in the soft manner poets praised. His face was too controlled, his mouth too severe, his manner too economical with warmth. But he listened when she spoke of schedules, of reading levels, of Alice's tendency to hide unfinished sums beneath the globe stand. He answered in measured tones, never unkind, never familiar, and looked at her as if she were a necessary element of household governance, no more and no less. For 6 days it had been enough. On the 7th, a footman appeared at the schoolroom door just before 4 o'clock, his livery immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. "His lordship requests you in the library, Miss Ivanov." Barbara's pulse gave one hard thud. Summoned by the master of the house outside routine hours could mean many things, few of them comfortable for a governess. Had Edmund spoken of climbing the balustrade? Had she overstepped by replacing the French tutor's outdated texts? Had Lady Kettering already sent inquiries? She told Alice to continue with her copywork, told Edmund to keep the bandage dry, and descended the broad staircase to the west corridor, where the library doors stood partly open. Lord Greythorne was behind the great walnut desk, not seated but standing with one hand on an open ledger. Late light from the tall windows struck his profile, turning the silver at his temple to steel. At first glance he appeared as he always did, contained, unruffled, faintly remote. Then he looked up, and she saw that stillness had changed shape. It was not indifference, it was concentration sharpened to a point. "You sent for me, my lord?" He inclined his head. "Thank you for coming. Close the door, if you please." She did, hearing the click of the latch like a lock in her ribs. He touched the page before him with 2 fingers. "The monthly household abstracts were brought for signature this morning. New appointments are entered in full for the quarter's legal record." A pause. "Your name is entered as Miss Barbara Ivanov." It was an odd statement, and something in his voice stripped it of formality. "Yes, my lord?" He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than custom required. "Was your father Captain Mikhail Ivanov? Peninsular campaigns, attached for a time to the 17th? No one at Greythorne knew that name. She had made certain of it. For years she had spoken it rarely enough that when she whispered it in prayer it sounded borrowed from someone else's life. "Yes," she said, each letter careful. "He was." Something moved across Lord Greythorne's face too quickly to name. Recognition, perhaps, and the unmistakable wound of memory. He turned to a dispatch box on the sideboard, unlocked it with a key he drew from his watch chain, and returned with a packet wrapped in faded blue ribbon. The papers were worn at the folds. A miniature in a cracked case slid into view. A young officer with dark eyes and an expression Barbara knew in her bones. Her breath left her as if struck. "My father," she said. Lord Greythorne nodded once. "I received these 12 years ago from Lieutenant Harbury, who was dying of fever in Badajoz. He had served with your father. Harbury told me Captain Ivanov pulled me from gunfire outside Ciudad Rodrigo after my horse went down. I had no memory of the man's name at the time, only of being alive when by rights I ought not to have been." His tone remained level, but the levelness cost him. "Harbury said your father was dead," Greythorne continued, "and that he feared for the daughter left in England after your mother's passing. He asked that if I ever encountered Miss Barbara Ivanov, I should see her protected." He gave the briefest, driest smile, bitter as unsweetened tea. "I was 26 and believed myself equal to any promise. I put these away to act upon if circumstance demanded. Circumstance did not present itself until now." Barbara could not look away from the miniature. Her father's uniform collar was slightly askew, as it always had been after long days. A nick marked one brow where he had laughed off a saber's kiss. He had taught her French by candlelight and card games by the kitchen fire. He had taught her, too, that papers mattered because men forgot and ink endured. "Preserve what names you can, little bird," he had said, tapping her nose with an ink-stained finger. "The world grows convenient amnesia when money is involved." "Why did no one contact me?" she asked, then hated how quickly the question escaped. Greythorne did not pretend not to understand. "Because I failed to pursue what I should have pursued. Harbury had no settled address for you beyond a London direction that proved useless by the time inquiries were made. I accepted too easily that the matter had gone cold. His jaw tightened. I should not have. Silence stretched, filled by rain tapping the panes. At last Barbara said, "And now?" "Now," he said, "I intend to make good on a debt long overdue." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they lit every caution she possessed. Debt made patrons. Patrons made terms. Terms became cages with velvet lining. "I am employed here to teach your children," she said carefully. "I ask only to perform that duty well." He studied her, as if hearing the refusal beneath the politeness. "No one suggests otherwise, Miss Ivanoff." Yet, when she returned to the schoolroom, the air of the house had altered by a degree too slight to name and too strong to ignore. The alteration began with little things. On Sunday, rather than taking her tray alone in the former nursery as had been arranged, Barbara was informed that Lady Eleanor Ashford, Lord Greythorne's widowed sister, resident at the Abbey these past 2 years, would be pleased by Miss Ivanoff's company at luncheon in the small morning room. Lady Eleanor proved kind-eyed and intelligent, with a laugh that seemed to have survived private grief by stubborn discipline. She asked Barbara about books, not bloodlines. She passed the marmalade as though this were perfectly ordinary. On Tuesday, when the butler addressed Barbara as "girl" before the children, Lord Greythorne corrected him without raising his voice. "Miss Ivanoff is the children's governess and will be spoken to accordingly. Dobbins." The butler went red to the ears. Word reached every corridor before dinner. On Wednesday evening, crossing the lower gallery with a stack of copybooks, Barbara nearly collided with the Earl himself. He stepped aside at once and said, with abrupt directness that sounded almost like alarm, "Are your rooms sufficiently warm? Mrs. Finch tells me the north chimneys draw poorly in rain." Barbara blinked. "They are adequate, my lord." "Adequate is not the standard." He frowned slightly, as if irritated by his own sentence. "I will have it seen to." Such courtesies should have been harmless. In a fairer world they would have been. In a great house, from a great man to a dependent woman, they glittered too brightly and drew eyes like blades. By Friday, Barbara heard the whispers, not only from maids, but from visiting neighbours who lingered after tea in Lady Eleanor's parlour. "She is very young for such consequence, is she not?" "Foreign, I'm told." An earl cannot be expected to maintain proper distance if he insists on noticing every governess with a tragic profile. Lady Eleanor shut one conversation down with aristocratic frost. Another she perhaps did not hear. Barbara heard all of them and stitched her face into calm. She knew precisely what could be made of kindness. She had watched Lady Kettering ruin a cousin's match by sighing in company that the girl had accepted too many carriage rides from a married viscount, then adding, "Of course I am sure there was innocence. One must trust innocence where one can." The cousin had married a curate 3 counties away. For Barbara, scandal was not merely social discomfort. If Greythorne's protection marked her, she could lose this post, the only honourable income between herself and coercion. If she lost it, Lady Kettering would find her. Lady Kettering always found what she considered revenue, and there was more at stake than wages. Barbara had rebuilt herself from humiliation one practical task at a time. Timetables, handwriting drills, French declensions, mended hems, paid bills. To be reduced again to an object of male patronage, grateful, silent, transferable, would be a second dispossession, no less complete for being draped in benevolence. That evening she sat at her narrow desk under the slanted eaves, lamp turned low, and opened the small tin box she kept beneath folded chemises. Inside lay the remnants of her former life, 2 letters in her father's hand, a baptism certificate, a faded receipt book, and one page torn from Lady Kettering's correspondence by accident or providence years before. The page bore only half a paragraph and no signature, but the line had burned into Barbara's memory. The trustees need never trouble themselves if the girl is settled quickly. Captain I left nothing in ready sums, whatever nonsense may be repeated by sentimental acquaintances. Whatever nonsense. If there had been anything left, pension, settlement, trust, Barbara had never seen it. She had believed, because she had been told and told again, that misfortune had simply happened to her, that she had slipped through cracks of war and widowhood and the carelessness of men. But misfortune in Lady Kettering's household was seldom accidental. It was managed. A knock sounded on the door. Barbara shut the tin box at once. "Come in." Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, entered with a face pinched by unease. "Beg pardon, miss. I thought you ought to know before it spreads through servants' hall." She hesitated. A carriage arrived at dusk from London. Lady Kettering's crest! For a second the room tipped, then righted itself by force of habit. "Her ladyship," Barbara asked, though she already knew, "she has taken the blue guest suite and sent word she'll speak to his lordship at breakfast. She told me—" Mrs. Finch stopped, clearly regretting repeating it. "She said you are under her guardianship and to be prepared to return with her immediately." Barbara set both hands flat on the desk, so Mrs. Finch would not see them tremble. "Thank you," she said. "You were right to tell me." When the housekeeper withdrew, Barbara remained motionless, listening to the wind drag rain along the eaves. 1 week she had been governess at Greythorn Abbey, for 1 week before her father's name rose from a ledger and dragged the past into daylight. 1 week before debt, honour and gossip began weaving a net around her. Downstairs, in rooms lit by more candles than she could afford in a month, Lady Kettering would already be arranging her smile, benevolent to witnesses, iron underneath. She would speak of propriety, obligations, expenses incurred for a thankless girl. She would count on Barbara's fear, on society's appetite for an obedient scandal, on the old truth that a woman without money was presumed to have no memory worth believing. Barbara opened the tin box again and took out her father's letters. The paper crackled like dry leaves. She read the first line by lamplight until the words steadied into resolve. Whatever came at breakfast, she would not go quietly. Not this time. She did not sleep so much as wait for dawn with her eyes shut. Every creak of the old abbey settled into her bones, as if the house itself were listening. At 6:30 she rose, dressed with deliberate neatness in her plain grey wool, braided her dark hair tight against her head, and pinned at her throat the one small jet brooch that had been her mother's. Armour could be modest and still be armour. By 8 o'clock the breakfast room held too much fragrance and too little air. Lady Kettering sat nearest the fire in plum silk and black lace, despite the hour, diamonds at her ears catching light with each tilt of her head. She had always dressed as if entering a room were an attack. Her perfume, orange blossom over musk, arrived before her voice did. "Barbara, my dear child." She smiled without softness. "How wan you look! Country employment does nothing for your complexion." Barbara inclined her head. "Lady Kettering." Lord Greythorn stood at the sideboard speaking in low tones to Lady Eleanor, but he turned as Barbara entered. His expression did not alter. Only the set of his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly toward readiness. Lady Kettering laid down her coffee spoon with tiny precision. "I have explained matters to Lord Greythorn. You are under my legal guardianship until your majority papers are regularised, and there are debts attached to your maintenance in my household. I shall take you back to London this afternoon. Your trunk can be packed by noon." The words came so smoothly. They might have been kindness. Barbara took the chair opposite her and unfolded her napkin. "I did not consent to returning. My consent is sufficient." Lady Kettering gave a brittle laugh toward Lady Eleanor, as if indulging childish stubbornness. "You see how spirited she has become. Quite impossible among impressionable children." Graythorne spoke then, his voice level. "Miss Ivanov is in my employ, Lady Kettering. Any alteration to that arrangement will be discussed in my study with documents." Lady Kettering turned her smile on him. "Of course, my lord, I brought copies. One hates informality in legal matters." She drew from a reticule a folded packet, tied in cream ribbon, and slid it across the polished table. Barbara recognised the theatrics, always present a lie with impeccable stationery. Graythorne did not touch the packet immediately. "Copies are not originals." "Originals are in my London solicitor's keeping, quite proper." "Then we shall require certified extracts before any action is considered." A pulse jumped in Lady Kettering's jaw, visible for a heartbeat before composure returned. "Surely you cannot mean to entangle yourself in this domestic inconvenience. The girl has no independent means. I have supported her at considerable expense since her father's death." Barbara kept her fork still in her hand, though her fingers were beginning to numb. "At considerable convenience, you mean?" Lady Kettering's eyes cut to her. "Mind your tone." Barbara met her gaze. "You speak of my father as if he left me a burden and his widow's second husband charity to bestow. He left a name you have spent years trying to erase. Do not expect me to help you now." There was a brittle silence. Even the footman at the tea urn seemed to stop breathing. Lady Kettering leaned back, lips thinning. Captain Ivanov was a foreign adventurer with romantic notions and no prudence. Something hot and clean rose through Barbara's fear and burned it away. "He was an officer who kept his word," she said, each syllable clear. "I cannot say the same for everyone at this table." Lady Eleanor inhaled sharply. Graythorne set down his cup with controlled care. Lady Kettering gave a little shrug as if correcting a servant. "You mistake ingratitude for principle. You were taken in, clothed, presented, and very nearly settled respectably, despite your defects of portion and—" "Sold," Barbara said. The single word cracked across the room. Lady Kettering blinked. "How vulgar! How accurate! I will not be sold twice." Graythorne's gaze moved from Barbara to Lady Kettering and cooled another degree. "This discussion is concluded for now. Lady Kettering, you are my guest. While you remain at Graythorne, you will extend, Miss Ivanov, the civility due any lady under my roof." Lady Kettering stood, rustling silk. "You are making an error, my lord. Society has a narrow tolerance for misplaced chivalry. Then society may broaden itself." She gathered her reticule and papers, giving Barbara one long look in which promise and threat were braided together. "Noon, then, in your study," she said to Graythorne. "I dislike delay." When she swept out, perfume lingering like smoke, Barbara realised only then that she had eaten nothing. Her tea had gone cold. Lady Eleanor reached across and touched Barbara's wrist lightly. "You did very well," she murmured. Barbara gave a short, unsteady exhale that might have been a laugh in gentler weather. "I did very dangerously, I think." Graythorne said, "Danger was brought here before breakfast. You merely answered it." Noon in the study became 1 o'clock, then 2, then 1/2 past, as solicitors were summoned by express, references demanded, and Lady Kettering's irritation sharpened to open disdain. She produced copies of guardianship claims and itemised household expenditures attributed to Barbara, dressmaker charges for gowns Barbara had never worn, subscription fees to musicales she had never attended, carriage hire on nights she had not left the house. "Standard accounting," Lady Kettering said coolly when questioned. Graythorne reviewed each sheet in silence. At intervals he asked for dates, witnesses, receipts. Each question was brief and impossibly specific. By the fourth, Lady Kettering began to answer too quickly. Barbara stood at the side table, outwardly composed, inwardly counting breaths. By evening no resolution had been reached, which was itself a victory. Lady Kettering declared she would remain until this childish resistance is corrected. Graythorne replied that she was free to remain as guest, but not to remove an employee under disputed claim. The words were polite, the terms were iron. That should have ended it for the day. It did not. By supper 2 notes had arrived for Graythorne, both borne by riders who did not wait for reply. One from Sir Matthew Colne, advising extreme caution where dependents and appearances are concerned. Another from an older Marquis, who had known Graythorne since boyhood, warning against romantic interference in obscure continental entanglements. Obscure continental entanglements. Barbara read the phrase upside down, where the Marquis's heavy hand showed through the page as it lay briefly on the sideboard. She felt absurdly like laughing again. In the schoolroom the next morning, Alice asked in a whisper, "Is that glittering lady going to send you away?" Barbara bent over Alice's copybook and corrected a comma. "That glittering lady has no authority over Latin punctuation," she said, "and neither have you. Continue." Edmund, bandage removed and pride restored, scowled at his declensions with militant loyalty. "If she sends you, I shall refuse geography forever." "You already refuse geography whenever possible," Barbara said. Do not pretend principle where laziness will do." He grinned despite himself. The ordinary exchange steadied her more than any formal assurance could. Yet, outside the schoolroom, ordinary had become fragile. Servants' voices dropped when she passed. A neighbour calling on Lady Eleanor allowed himself to remark, within earshot, that governesses with histories are best settled quickly before children become attached. Lady Eleanor replied audibly that children ought perhaps to be attached to integrity while they had the chance. By the 3rd day of siege, Barbara understood that waiting for Lady Kettering to overreach would not be enough. Lady Kettering had made a life out of overreach disguised as paperwork. If there was proof to counter her, it would be in ink. After lessons, she went to Graythorne's library, where he stood sorting correspondence into disciplined piles. "My lord," she said, "you asked for documents. So do I." He looked up at once. "What precisely are you seeking?" "Any records in which my name appears before this week. My father's pension notices, trustee references, signatures bearing yours connected with my maintenance." She held his gaze. "Lady Kettering cited legal regularisation. She never cites law unless she has already twisted it." Something unreadable passed over his face. Approval, perhaps, edged with concern. "There are archived estate ledgers in the muniment room, and copies of outgoing correspondence with the London agents. Mr. Pritchard can bring what's relevant." "Please do not have it brought. What's relevant?" Barbara said. "Have it all brought." His mouth almost softened. "Very well." For 2 evenings and a morning she worked at the long table in the muniment room, with dust on her sleeves and candle grease on her fingers, while rain thudded on the stone beyond the narrow windows. Mr. Pritchard, the steward, fetched trunks and muttered about disorderly filing. Lady Eleanor sent sandwiches no one touched until they were stale. Barbara read by date, then by name, then by the shape of numbers that repeated too neatly. At first there was nothing but ordinary estate business, rents, timber, repairs, annuities. Then a thread appeared, a letter from the War Office acknowledging issuance of arrears due to the surviving minor issue of Captain M. Ivanov, directed in trust care of Lady Kettering's London address. A receipt signed. Barbara stared. B. Ivanov! In a hand that looped the B backward, nothing like hers at any age. Another document. Authorization for transfer of funds from a temporary trust into consolidated household account under guardian stewardship. Witness line, J. Ashford. She froze. The signature looked right at first glance, then wrong in the pressure of the downstroke, as if copied by someone patient but not practiced. Beside it sat a clerk's notation of date and filing source. Barbara reached for another ledger from that week's entries. On the day the authorization purported to have been signed, Lord Greythorne had been recorded, by his own estate books, as travelling between Hampshire properties, miles from London. Her pulse began to hammer in her throat. There were more. Pension disbursements redirected. Trustee notices, marked received but unanswered. One letter from a junior solicitor politely querying why no acknowledgement had come from Lord Greythorne's office. And then, months later, another stating, in absence of objection, we proceed as instructed by Lady K. No objection. No answer. Dubart's silence converted into consent. By the time the Abbey bell struck 4, Barbara's neat stacks had become battlements. She sat very straight, hands blackened with dust, and felt something inside her reorder itself. She had believed herself unlucky, unwanted, inconvenient. Those beliefs had shaped every compromise she had made. But this was not weather. This was design. She gathered the key documents, tied them with twine, then paused and went upstairs to her room for the tin box. From it she took the 2 letters in her father's hand, and, from beneath the lining, a thinner packet she had not opened in years. Copies of names and dates he had made her memorize as a child game. Witnesses, little bird, in case ever memory is disputed. At 9 she had thought it an adventure. At 22 she understood it as strategy. When she returned to the library, Greythorne was alone, coat off, spectacles in hand as he read by the fire. He looked up at once, then rose when he saw her face. "You found something?" "Yes." She set the bundle on the desk and untied it. One by one she laid out the receipt, the transfer authorization, the War Office letter, the ledger entry showing his location elsewhere. He read without interruption. Only once did he make a sound, a short breath through his teeth as he reached the false signature. "At a glance," he said quietly, "it would pass." "At a glance," Barbara replied. "I did not starve. At a glance. I was merely ungrateful." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked directly at her. There was no defence in his expression now, only a hard, contained self-reproach. "These papers were processed through agents who held my authority in routine matters," he said. "I signed packets without scrutiny during that period, too many, too quickly. If she slipped this among them, or counterfeited from a genuine specimen, my negligence made room for it." Negligence! The word was honest and inadequate at once. He moved to the decanter, poured water instead of brandy, and did not drink it. "I can rectify this immediately. I will settle on you a sum equal to all losses and more. Quietly. And I can secure you a position with my cousins in Northumberland until this noise subsides. No one there would dare slight you." Barbara stared at him. It was a generous offer. It was exactly what men of honour offered when they still wished the world undisturbed. Compensation, relocation, discretion. Safety purchased at the price of silence. "No," she said. He went still. "Miss Ivanov, no." Her voice sharpened, then steadied. "I am grateful for your intent. I will not accept your arrangement." "Why?" Because it leaves her untouched. Because it says the matter is embarrassing, not criminal. Because I am tired of being moved like a parcel whenever someone powerful wishes peace. Colour rose in her cheeks. She let it. I do not want rescue. I want record in daylight. Greythorn's jaw tightened. Daylight will bring scandal you cannot control. Darkness has controlled me quite enough. She placed her father's letters beside the forged papers. He taught me to keep these. Names, witnesses, instructions. I thought I preserved them from sentiment. I preserved them for this. He looked at the old paper, at the angular Russian-tinged hand, at the list of officers and one chaplain and 2 solicitors long dead or retired, but traceable through registers. He read in a silence, then lifted his gaze to hers. What do you ask of me? Not what do you require, not what shall I do for you. The distinction landed between them like a door opening. Barbara answered without lowering her eyes. Stand beside me when this is challenged, not in private settlement, in open claim. A long pause. Rain ticked at the windows. Somewhere in the corridor a clock began to strike 10. When the last chime faded, Greythorn said very clearly, Yes! He gathered the papers into a single ordered stack and rang for his secretary. We begin tonight, he said. No more quiet. The secretary arrived within minutes. Mr. Larkin, thin, ink-fingered and fully awake in the way only men accustomed to emergencies on paper could be. Greythorn gave instructions without flourish. Certified copies to be requested from War Office and Pension Office at first light. A messenger to London for Mr. Hale, his solicitor. Notices to be drafted preserving all estate correspondence relating to Captain Ivanov's trust. No document to leave the library without duplicate and witness. Barbara stood by the fire, listening to her own future translated into legal verbs. At the doorway, Larkin hesitated. My lord, Lady Kettering's man asked whether he should carry any post back to her London office tonight. Greythorn did not look up. He may carry this. Nothing leaves this house without my inspection. By morning, Lady Kettering had made her reply anyway. She did not send one move. She sent 4. First, she received callers early and loudly in the blue drawing-room, where doors were left conveniently ajar. By 11, half the county had heard that Miss Ivanov was in a state of distressing instability and being manipulated by persons with interests adverse to her reputation. Second, a note arrived from Mr. Pelham, all concern and oily civility, reminding Barbara that he held promissory claims against Lady Kettering's household in which your maintenance costs are materially included. He trusted she would not oblige him to pursue recovery through court. Third, the Abbey's stable lad returned from town with a broadside folded in his cap. A gossip sheet from London, already 2 days old, implying that a certain northern earl had developed reforming zeal in the person of his governess. Fourth, and worst, a constable came to the house just after luncheon with a provisional order from a London commissioner. Pending review of guardianship dispute, Miss Barbara Ivanov was to be considered under Lady Kettering's direction and discouraged from removal. Discouraged. The word sat on the page like a hand on her throat. The constable, a decent-faced man embarrassed by fine carpets, shifted his hat and said to Greythorn, No arrest, my lord, only service and acknowledgement. Greythorn read the order twice, then asked, Issued on what affidavits? Lady Kettering's declaration, sir, and statement by her solicitor's clerk that the young lady was induced to flee lawful household control. Induced! Flee! Lawful! Barbara felt heat rise under her skin and then drain away, leaving her cold. Greythorn signed acknowledgement with a stroke so controlled it might have been carved. You have served the paper, You may tell the Commissioner that counter-affidavits are already in preparation." When the constable bowed himself out, Lady Kettering entered from the passage as if summoned by applause. "I regret theatrics," she said, not regretting anything, but children do not always obey private correction. Barbara stood very straight. "I am not your child." "No," Lady Kettering said softly. "You are my expense." Lady Eleanor appeared at Barbara's shoulder before Greythorn could answer. "And my guest," she said, voice edged in winter. "Leave us, Clara." Lady Kettering's smile never wavered. "By all means. Do enjoy your principals while they are affordable." She glided away in plum silk, victorious for the moment because she had shifted the battleground. No longer merely a question of stolen pension and forged papers. Now it was guardianship, propriety, reputation, jurisdiction. Mud deep enough to drown truth in procedure. That afternoon the schoolroom was closed. Lady Eleanor took Alice and Edmund to the conservatory with storybooks and seed catalogues, while Barbara and Greythorn met Mr. Hale, newly arrived and grave, in the study. Hale reviewed everything, spectacles low on his nose. "The forgery evidence is serious," he said, "but Lady Kettering has moved first in the forum society respects most. Scandal wrapped in legal concern. If Miss Ivanoff is painted as unstable or compromised, magistrates may delay to avoid appearing partisan." "Delay favours theft," Barbara said. "Precisely, which is why she seeks it." He tapped the false receipt. "We can petition for immediate review, but we need witness affidavits by tomorrow night. One from War Office disbursement clerk if possible. One from anyone who can speak to Miss Ivanoff's signature over years. One from your lordship on record regarding the questioned authorization." Greythorn said, "You shall have mine within the hour." Hale held his gaze. "Understand what that means. Opposing counsel will ask whether you extended unusual attention to your governess before discovering this matter." A silence. "I did," Greythorn said, "because her father saved my life and because she was being slighted under my roof." Hale exhaled through his nose. "Then we draft with care and pray for literacy in the bench." If Lady Kettering succeeded, Barbara would not merely lose wages. She would be removed under protection, likely married or hidden before any hearing matured, her evidence reframed as hysterical invention. The children would learn that truth spoken without rank was punished. Greythorn's testimony would be dismissed as gallantry or guilt, and every stolen pound would remain blessed by paperwork. By dusk, the abbey hummed like a campaign camp before rain. Riders out, candles burning late, servants carrying sealed packets under orders to avoid gossip and therefore spreading it faster. Barbara signed affidavit drafts until her wrist cramped. She signed her own name 3 times on blank paper too, so Hale could compare hand and pressure. In the corner, Edmund's abandoned slate still held half a map of Spain. She looked at it and thought not for the first time that war changed uniforms but rarely methods. At Hale's instruction, the estate exhibits stayed sealed in the library under witness lock, while Barbara reclaimed her own tin box originals to prepare a separate sworn inventory at dawn. She intended to place them in Hale's custody again after one final comparison of dates and signatures. The setback came from inside the walls. At 9:30, just as Hale was preparing to dispatch the first packet to York, Mr. Pritchard requested immediate audience, face grey beneath his careful whiskers. "Beg pardon, my lord," he said, twisting his cap. "There's been an incident." Barbara was already standing before he finished. "My room," she said. Pritchard nodded once. They climbed the servants' back stair in hard silence, Greythorn 1 step behind her, Hale wheezing slightly in the rear. Barbara reached her door and stopped. The lock plate was splintered, not broken cleanly, worked at, then forced. Inside, drawers were open, chemises flung, mattress shifted from the narrow bedstead. The small washstand had been overturned. Her tin box lay on the floor, lid bent. She crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to her knees. Empty. No letters. No witness list. No baptism certificate. Nothing but one cracked button and a ribbon fragment caught in the hinge. For a moment she did not understand what she was seeing. Her mind kept insisting there would be a hidden compartment, a second packet, some ordinary explanation. Then sound returned, the wind, Hale swearing softly, Graythorne saying her name, and she knew Lady Kettering had not only counted the case, she had reached into Barbara's one private refuge and taken the proof tied to blood. Barbara sat back on her heels, palms black with dust from the floorboards. Who had access? Pritchard swallowed. Any senior maid with corridor keys, miss. And Lady Kettering's woman requested hot water here at 7. Said your ladyship had sent for lavender salts. I sent no one, Lady Eleanor said from the doorway, white with anger. Graythorne turned to Pritchard, voice quiet enough to frighten. Lock the gates. No servant leaves tonight without search and written inventory. Lady Kettering is confined to her rooms pending inquiry. Pritchard blanched. My lord, can we confine... You can obey. Hale rubbed his forehead. We must assume the documents are already in transit. If they vanish entirely, opposing counsel will say they never existed. Barbara rose slowly, using the bedpost for balance because her legs were no longer reliable. Not entirely, she said. You have the forged receipts and pension records. Enough to suggest irregularity, Hale said. Not enough to anchor identity and intent as cleanly as your father's original letter would. Graythorne took one step toward her, then stopped, as if unsure whether touch would steady or shatter. We can still proceed, Barbara laughed once, a sound with no humour in it. Can we, or do we now proceed on your word and my outrage against her title? No one answered. The search that followed yielded humiliations, and nothing useful. Lady Kettering's trunks full of silk, scent, and innocent correspondence. Her maid in tears. 2 footmen indignant at being searched. 1 cook outraged that anyone suspected her of conspiracy with a lady who sent back soup. By midnight, no packet had been found. Then came the second blow. A messenger arrived from York with notice that Mr. Ellison, the retired War Office clerk Hale had relied on for affidavit, had suffered a stroke that afternoon and could not speak. His son, alarmed by inquiries, declined involvement in contentious noble family matters. Hale read the note twice, jaw set. Without Ellison, authentication of disbursement chain is delayed. Weeks, perhaps. We do not have weeks, Barbara said. No, he agreed. We have a hearing request at county sessions in 48 hours and an opponent who will ask for adjournment while branding you unstable. Barbara went back to her room because there was nowhere else to go. Mrs. Finch had righted the washstand and folded what could be folded. The bent tin box sat on the desk like a small metal coffin. She touched it once and sat down on the chair without removing her shoes. In the schoolroom she could solve problems. 1 frightened child, 1 bleeding forehead, 1 lesson plan. Here she had done everything her father taught her, kept records, guarded names, moved fast, and still watched evidence disappear because someone richer wanted it gone. For the first time since dawn, doubt entered cleanly. What if Lady Kettering was right about the world, if not about the facts? What if truth without rank was only noise? What if she had dragged Graythorne and his children into ruin and would still be carried back to London in another woman's carriage, only now, as the mad, ungrateful governess who accused her benefactress and lost. A knock sounded. She did not answer. After a moment, Alice's small voice came through the panel. "Miss Ivanoff, Edmund says if you are dead he wants your atlas." Barbara pressed her fist to her mouth and shut her eyes. Then she stood, opened the door, and let both children fling themselves at her waist with the brutal mercy of affection. "I am not dead," she said into Alice's hair, "and no one is inheriting anything tonight." Julian Ashford remained in the library after the house finally quieted. He had sent orders all evening, signed statements, spoken in measured tones that made men move. Control was a habit worn so long it had become skin. Yet now, alone with the guttering candles and Captain Ivanoff's miniature on the desk, he discovered control had edges, and he was at one. He picked up the miniature. The painted officer's dark gaze was still direct, still unembarrassed by courage. "You dragged me from gunfire," Julian thought, "and I misplaced your daughter in paperwork." He had been 21 at Ciudad Rodrigo, stupid with rank and speed. He remembered the horse going down, the impact, the sudden clarity of bullets cracking stone. A hand at his collar. A voice with an accent he had not recognised barking, "Move, you aristocratic fool!" Then mud, blood, and waking later with someone saying an Allied captain had taken the shot meant for him. He had built his life afterward on duty because duty was measurable. Estates balanced, tenants paid, children fed, clothed, instructed after their mother died, and left a silence in every corridor. He could not bring Marianne back. He could keep order. He could not unknot war. He could honour debts when they presented themselves. Only he had failed at that too. Not from malice, from assumption, from signing what arrived, from trusting systems designed by men like him, for men like him, while a child with his rescuer's name vanished into London rooms where accounts were weaponised. And now Barbara stood in his house, proud and furious and tired to the bone, refusing rescue because rescue had always come chained. He set the miniature down and pressed thumb and forefinger against his eyes until stars flared. He was afraid, not of scandal, though that would come, not of losing dinners with men whose regard had never fed anyone. Afraid of repeating the oldest Ashford sin, to decide for others in the name of protection. He had nearly done it again in offering settlement and exile, as if justice were a sum and a carriage north. A soft knock. Eleanor entered without waiting. "You should sleep," she said. "I should have looked 12 years ago." Eleanor came to the hearth and stood beside him. "Yes." He let out a breath that almost broke. "If this fails, she loses everything again because I was late twice." "You are not late now." He gave a short, bitter smile. "Tell that to her empty tin box." Eleanor's expression gentled. "Then listen to me instead. You cannot atone for every old cowardice by being infallible tonight. Stand where you promised. Do not retreat into management because feeling makes you clumsy." He looked at her, startled into a rough laugh. "Is that your diagnosis, physician?" "It is my warning, brother." When she left, Julian remained by the fire until it dropped to embers. Then he took fresh paper and began drafting not as an earl defending household convenience, but as a witness admitting fault in full. At the top he wrote in his own hand, without secretary's polish, "I, Julian Ashford, Earl of Greythorn, state that my prior negligence enabled fraudulent use of my name." He did not stop when the line trembled. By morning, Lady Kettering made her final move. She refused breakfast, requested her carriage, then sent a sealed note to Barbara through Dobbins, with triumph thinly hidden beneath propriety. At tonight's Ridley assembly, before appropriate witnesses, you will acknowledge in writing that your allegations were made under emotional strain and withdraw all claims. In return, I shall resume guardianship privately and spare Lord Greythorne further embarrassment. Refuse, and I deliver sworn testimony of your improper intimacy, Mr. Pelham's debt action, and the Commissioner's order for your immediate removal. Bring whatever papers you imagine support you. I welcome illumination. At the bottom, in a harder hand, I have what was in your box. Barbara read it twice. The room seemed very bright. Hale, summoned at once, read and swore under his breath. She means to stage manage the county. Magistrate Ridley will attend the Assembly Committee room before dancing begins. If you do not appear, she paints you fugitive. If you appear and are shouted down, she claims recantation by default, Greythorne said. Then we appear first and file directly with Ridley before she can theatrically perform innocence. Hale shook his head. Ridley is cautious to a fault. In a private chamber he may delay. In a crowded room, with the names at stake, he may be forced to act. She knows it. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, said, She means to make spectacle the weapon. Barbara folded Lady Kettering's note carefully along its crease. Then spectacle is what she shall have. Greythorne looked at her. You need not do this tonight. Yes, I do. If I hide, she wins by narrative. If I speak, I may lose by noise, but at least the words are mine. For a heartbeat he seemed about to argue. Instead, he nodded once. Then we go together. Outside, rain had stopped. The sky hung low and metallic, as if undecided. Inside, preparations moved with military precision. Carriage ordered, affidavits copied, witnesses notified, Mrs. Finch producing Barbara's plainest black gown, because armour sometimes needed to look like gravity. Just before they left, Edmund caught Barbara's sleeve in the hall. Are you coming back? He asked, trying for casual and missing by miles. Barbara crouched to his height. I intend to. He glanced toward the front doors where men were loading document boxes. If that glittering lady shouts, shout louder. Alice, solemn beside him, offered Barbara a crumpled scrap of paper. On it, in uneven script, Miss Ivanoff never lies about commas. Barbara kissed both children and stood before her throat could close. At the carriage, Greythorne handed her up, then paused with one boot on the step, looking back at the Abbey as though measuring what might be lost before night was done. Hale climbed in opposite them, files on his knees. The wheels lurched. Greythorne settled beside Barbara, close enough that she could feel the tension in him, like drawn wire. As they turned onto the road toward Ridley Hall, bells from the town church began striking the quarter hour. Each chime sounded less like time passing and more like countdown. The lamps at Ridley Hall were already blazing when their carriage pulled into the crush of arrivals. Music leaked through the open doors, violins bright and brittle, while footmen shouted over wheels and horses and weather. Inside, the assembly rooms would be warm with wax and perfume and the feverish pleasure of people convinced they were merely attending a dance while waiting to witness a ruin. Hale gathered the document box to his chest. If Ridley can be reached before she begins, we may still... A liveried servant appeared at the step, bowing too deeply to be neutral. Lady Kettering requests Miss Ivanoff attend her at once, in the committee salon. Of course she does, Barbara said. Greythorne was already out of the carriage, one gloved hand lifted to assist her. You are not required to go anywhere alone. I will not. She set her hand in his and stepped down. But I am going where she expects me. If she wants a stage, she will have one I can stand on. They crossed the marble vestibule together, Hale at their shoulder, while heads turned in ripples. Names brushed the air like gnats. That is her! Greythorne brought her openly? God help us, Clara Kettering looks ready to bite. The committee salon stood off the ballroom, doors thrown wide to suggest propriety, while inviting spectators. Lady Kettering had arranged herself beside a writing desk beneath 2 branching candelabra. Mr. Pelham stood near her elbow, pink-faced and solemn in black, as if auditioning for injured virtue. Magistrate Ridley, narrow and stooped, occupied a chair by the mantel with the exhausted expression of a man who hated being important in public. "Miss Ivanoff," Lady Kettering said sweetly, "how punctual! We are all relieved." Barbara did not curtsy. "You sent for me?" "Out of concern. You have been encouraged into extravagant accusations. Lord Ridley has kindly agreed to witness your written clarification." She touched a paper on the desk. "Sign this brief withdrawal, and we spare everyone unpleasantness." Ridley cleared his throat. "This is not a hearing, merely an opportunity for a de-escalation." Hale stepped forward. "My client is prepared to file sworn affidavits and exhibits tonight, sir." "Client?" Lady Kettering laughed softly. "How modern! Shall we pretend she engages counsel from her embroidery allowance?" A titter rose from the doorway and died when Greythorne turned his head. Barbara looked at the paper on the desk. The first line read, "I, Barbara Ivanoff, acknowledge that in a state of nervous agitation, I made statements unsupported by fact." She lifted her eyes. "No." Lady Kettering's smile thinned. "Think carefully." "I have. You misused my father's pension. You forged my name and his lordship's authorization. You attempted to remove me under false guardianship. There is nothing to clarify." Pelham stepped in, oily concern brightening his eyes. "My dear miss, these are dangerous words for a young lady without protection. Your stepmother seeks only your restoration." Barbara turned to him. "And you seek repayment through marriage or seizure, whichever costs me more. We understand each other perfectly." Ridley rose halfway from his chair. "Miss Ivanoff, control yourself." Barbara felt the room pressing in, all those waiting faces deciding what version of her they preferred. Hysteric, adventurous, kept woman, cautionary tale. She heard her own pulse and, beneath it, her father's old instruction. "If they mean to define you, speak first." She stepped past the desk into the ballroom doorway before anyone could stop her. The musicians faltered. Conversation dropped in a visible wave. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice clear and carrying farther than she expected. "I ask your pardon for interrupting your evening. I do so because my character has been made a public instrument, and I decline to be played in silence." Ridley made a distressed motion with one hand. Lady Kettering hissed, "Barbara, return at once!" Barbara did not look back. "My father, Captain Mikhail Ivanoff, died believing his daughter's inheritance and pension would be held in trust. I possess records." She lifted the packet Hale had placed in her hand, showing disbursements diverted, signatures falsified, and legal notices intercepted. "Some original papers were stolen from my room last night. Copies and corroborating estate ledgers remain." Murmurs broke like surf. Someone said, "Stolen?" Lady Kettering strode into the doorway, silk, whispering like a blade. "You hear? Delusion. The poor girl imagines burglaries now." Barbara turned then, meeting her gaze. "You wrote this morning that you had what was in my box." She held up Lady Kettering's sealed note. "Would you like me to read that aloud as well?" A flush climbed from Lady Kettering's throat to her cheeks. "Private correspondence can be forged." "Indeed, you are familiar with the practice." A low, involuntary sound ran through the crowd. Hale moved quickly to Ridley, passing the note and affidavits. Ridley unfolded, read, frowned, read again. "Lady Kettering, did you send this?" "Of course I sent a conciliatory invitation, not an admission of theft." Barbara said, "Then let us test admission against fact. My father's final letter named witnesses entrusted with my protection. Lieutenant Harbury, Chaplain Ames, Solicitor Fenn, Major Willis. She spoke each name slowly. Those names appear again in War Office routing records tied to disbursement for me as minor issue. They also appear nowhere in Lady Kettering's submitted guardianship packet. Ridley looked up sharply. How do you know contents of records if originals are absent? Because I copied key names and dates years ago at my father's instruction. Because I memorised what concerned my life. Because women without money learn to keep archives in their heads when trunks are not safe. For the first time all evening, Ridley's eyes held respect instead of impatience. Lady Kettering recovered fast. "A theatrical memory proves nothing. I have proper documents." She snapped her fingers at her maid, who produced a leather folio. "Here, guardianship declaration, expenditure ledger, signed receipt by Barbara Ivanov, her own hand." Ridley took the folio. Barbara stepped closer, asking, "May I?" He hesitated, then passed the top sheet. The forged receipt lay there, the backward looped B. Barbara had stared at that shape for hours in the muniment room. Now, in full light, she saw what panic had missed. Beneath the brownish ink, faint scoring lines, as if someone had traced the signature using pressure first, then inked over. She looked up at Lady Kettering. "You practice my name." "Nonsense! You practice badly. At 16 I broke my right little finger falling from a pony. Since then, whenever I write capital B, the second stroke narrows at the base." She held out her hand. The knuckles still bent oddly. "This one broadens. It was made by someone with an uninjured hand, imitating mine." Ridley leaned in, peering. Hale said quietly, "We can produce writing samples." Graythorne spoke for the first time to the room at large. "And I attest that the authorization in this folio bearing my signature cannot be genuine. Estate travel records place me in Hampshire on the stated date." Lady Kettering turned on him with sudden venom. "How noble! Shall we also attest to how often you call her to your private library after dinner?" Gasps. Pelham seized the opening. "There, sir! Improper influence!" Barbara's stomach dropped, then steadied. This was the strike Lady Kettering had saved. Shame her into silence, smear him into retreat. She raised her voice before the noise could swell. "Yes, I was called to the library, to review my father's miniature and letter held there for 12 years, to examine estate ledgers proving theft. If you call that impropriety, then your definition condemns literacy." A laugh, quick, shocked, approving, escaped somewhere near the punch table. Lady Kettering took one step forward, fury stripping polish from her face. "You ungrateful little savage! I fed you, clothed you, and invoiced me for gowns I never wore!" Barbara shot back. "Would you like me to list the charges? 14 guineas to Madame Leroux on a night I was ill in bed. 8 guineas carriage hire to Vauxhall while I was in Surrey with Aunt Beatrice. You remember, because you sent no carriage and I walked back in rain." Lady Kettering's mouth opened, closed. She had not expected memory with dates attached. Ridley lifted a hand. "Enough! I will review all papers now," Barbara said. Every head turned. Ridley bristled. "Miss Ivanov, you do not direct this bench." "No, but if this is deferred, she removes funds by morning, as she has before. You are here, the documents are here, witnesses are here. Delay is decision. Decide!" The silence that followed was not polite. It was electric. Ridley looked from Barbara to Lady Kettering, to Graythorne, to the cluster of faces witnessing his caution. He understood, finally, that neutrality tonight would be read as permission. Before he could speak, Lady Kettering moved. She caught Barbara's wrist and yanked hard toward the committee salon. "You will come away this instant!" Pain flashed white up Barbara's arm. but training born of years with controlling hands answered before fear did. She twisted, stepped in, and broke the grip at the thumb. Lady Kettering stumbled. The reticule hanging from her wrist flew wide, struck the edge of the desk, and spilled its contents across the floor. Powder tin, vinaigrette, keyring, folded notes, and a familiar bundle tied with faded blue ribbon. Barbara stared at it. Then she dropped to her knees and snatched it up. The cracked miniature case flashed in the candlelight. A sound went through the room like a collective intake of breath. Lady Kettering lunged, but this time Greythorn intercepted, not touching her, only stepping between, one arm out. Witness, not rescuer. "Do not," he said. Barbara rose, ribbon clenched in her fist, and held the packet high enough for Ridley to see. "You asked for proof of theft." Ridley's face had gone hard. "Constable!" Two men at the back, summoned earlier by Hale and waiting discreetly, came forward at once. Ridley pointed to Lady Kettering's scattered effects. "Seize all documents on her person and in her carriage. Seal her accounts, pending inquiry. Lady Kettering, you will surrender keys and submit to examination of papers under my authority." "You cannot!" she snapped. "I am Lady Kettering, and presently under formal allegation of fraud, coercion, and document theft in my jurisdiction." Ridley's voice shook, but it held. "You may protest in writing." Pelham began. "Sir, this is irregular!" Ridley rounded on him. "So is extorting maintenance debts from a ward through marriage threat. Sit down, Mr. Pelham, before I add your name to this memorandum." Pelham sat. Lady Kettering stood very still, breathing fast, eyes fixed on Barbara with naked hatred. "You think this ends you well. They will never receive you." Barbara's wrist throbbed where fingers had dug crescent marks. She looked at the older woman who had taught her fear and accounts and the cost of being looked at, and felt, unexpectedly, not triumph, but release. "I am not asking to be received," she said. "I am done asking." They moved the formalities to the committee salon while the orchestra, after a stunned interval, resumed in uncertain fragments. Ridley took statements until his pen squeaked dry. Hale organised exhibits like battlefield triage. The constables returned with 2 locked dispatch cases from Lady Kettering's carriage and a ledger from Pelham's man containing notes against B.I. settlement potential. Lady Kettering fought every inch. She challenged jurisdiction, demanded private audience, accused Greythorn of conspiracy, accused Barbara of theft of her own property, accused Hale of manufacturing evidence. When shown the recovered packet, she said it had been planted. When shown her own note, she called it blackmail. When the maid, sobbing, admitted she had forced Barbara's door under orders, Lady Kettering slapped her hard enough to split her lip before the constable could intervene. "Liar!" she spat. "I took you from a workhouse." The maid whispered through blood, "No, my lady, you took me from my mother." Ridley's jaw tightened further. "Record that!" Near midnight, after 3 sworn statements and 1 aborted attempt by Lady Kettering to feign collapse, the magistrate signed an emergency order, provisional voiding of her immediate guardianship claims over Barbara pending full hearing, seizure of accounts connected to Captain Ivanov disbursement, injunction against removal or intimidation of Miss Ivanov, referral to Crown Prosecutor for forgery, and fiduciary fraud review. Lady Kettering read the order, then laughed once, low and disbelieving. "You sanctimonious fools! Do you imagine I acted alone? Half your wives transfer money through my solicitor because their husbands gamble like sailors." Ridley said, "Then half my district may have unpleasant mornings." She turned to Barbara one last time as the constable reached for her arm. "You would have been comfortable," she said, voice suddenly tired beneath the venom. A house, security, a husband old enough not to demand conversation. Comfort is worth more than pride, Barbara answered quietly. Not when comfort is a locked door. Lady Kettering's expression flickered. Rage, contempt, and for the briefest instant something like bewilderment that her arithmetic had failed. Then she lifted her chin and let the constable lead her out through a side entrance, as if choosing exile over spectacle. When the door closed behind her, the room exhaled. Barbara swayed once. Greythorn's hand hovered near her elbow, not touching until she nodded. Then his fingers closed lightly, steadying. "You are injured," he said, looking at her wrist. "Only bruised." Her voice felt used up. "Is it done?" Hale, ink on his cuff and victory only half trusted in his eyes, said, "The first battle is done. The rest will be in filings and hearings, and we are ahead for the first time." Ahead. The word landed strangely, like stepping onto ground after days at sea. Outside, someone in the ballroom struck up a country dance too loudly, as if music could erase what had happened in the next room. It could not. The world had shifted, and would not quite shift back. The ride home was quiet, except for wheels and harness, and Hale's occasional mutter over notes by carriage lamp. At Greythorn Abbey, the front hall stood lit, though it was near 2. Mrs. Finch waited in her wrapper, rigid with worry. Behind her hovered 2 footmen, pretending they had risen early rather than not slept. "Well?" Mrs. Finch asked, before propriety could stop her. Barbara held up the recovered blue ribbon packet. Mrs. Finch put a hand to her mouth and sat down abruptly on the nearest chest. "Thank God!" Alice and Edmund appeared halfway down the staircase in nightclothes, caught by no one because everyone had been listening for wheels. Edmund saw Barbara and came thundering down, despite Eleanor's hissed "shoes" from above. "Did you shout louder?" he demanded. Barbara laughed, then winced as laughter pulled her bruised wrist. "Loud enough." Alice reached solemnly for Barbara's hand, saw the marks, and frowned with ferocious outrage. "I dislike glittering ladies." "So do I," Barbara said. "Very much." Lady Eleanor descended, wrapped in a shawl, took in Barbara's face and Greythorn's, and simply opened her arms. Barbara let herself be held for 3 breaths before pulling back, because if she remained, she might break. "Bed," Eleanor ordered gently. "All of you except my brother and Mr. Hale, who may sit up ruining Clara's future with paperwork." Hale gave a tired bow. "Gladly." In her room, the broken lock had been replaced. Fresh water steamed in a basin. On the desk sat the bent tin box, lid straightened as best it could be. Barbara set the recovered packet inside and stood staring at it until her vision blurred. She had imagined this moment for years in savage, impossible flashes. Lady Kettering exposed, money restored, apologies begged. The reality was messier, ink-stained, exhausting, full of procedural language and witnesses and trembling hands. There was no clean triumph, only the absence of one particular terror. She had carried so long she had mistaken it for part of herself. She sank onto the bed, still half-dressed, and, for the first time since childhood, cried without trying to hide the sound. A soft knock came after some minutes. "Miss Ivanov?" Greythorn's voice, low through the door. "May I?" She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "Yes." He entered in shirt-sleeves, coat gone, cravat loosened, looking less like an earl than a man held together by intention. He stopped when he saw her eyes and did not pretend not to. "I brought arnica salve," he said, holding up a small jar with absurd formality. "For the wrist." She almost smiled. "You are very efficient after battles." "Efficiency is my cowardice when I do not know what else to offer." The honesty made her lift her head. He set the jar on the washstand, but did not come closer. "I will not keep you standing. I only needed to say this while the memory is sharp. What you did tonight was extraordinary. Not because you were fearless, because you were not. Because you were afraid and did it anyway. Barbara looked down at her hands. I thought my voice would fail in the first sentence. It did not. Silence settled, not awkward, just tired and real. At one point, she said quietly, when she caught my wrist, I was 17 again in her drawing room. For a second I believed she could still pull me anywhere, he answered just as quietly. And then I remembered I had witnesses. His mouth softened, grief and pride tangled there. You have them still. When he left, he bowed at the door as always, but before the door closed he added, almost rough, Sleep, Barbara. He had never used her Christian name before. She lay awake another hour anyway, listening to the house breathe around her in a new key. 6 weeks later, in Greythorn's rose garden stripped to winter stems, Julian asked her to marry him, not at a ball, not in a drawing room, not with family arranged as benevolent furniture. In the garden, because Barbara had escaped the post-hearing luncheon, and he had followed with 2 untouched teacups, and nowhere else to put what he meant to say. The final order had come that morning. Lady Kettering censured, her guardianship claims void, restitution scheduled from seized accounts and liquidated securities. Prosecution recommended on 2 counts of forgery and 1 of coercive fraud. Pelham's debt claims were rejected as unenforceable against Barbara's person. It was victory on paper with years of consequences still to unfold, but it was law, not rumour. Barbara stood by the stone balustrade, reading the order again despite knowing each line. Her recovered funds looked obscene in numbers she had never possessed. Freedom, it turned out, had commas. Julian set the cups down on the cold stone between them. You will catch your death out here. I survived Lady Kettering. I think weather must cue. He gave a short laugh, and then unexpectedly no smile followed. May I speak plainly? You are an earl. I assumed plainness was hereditary, but endangered. Barbara! There was something in his voice that stilled her. I have spent most of my life mistaking restraint for virtue, he said. Sometimes it is. Often it is fear wearing good manners. Since you came here, I have offered you duty, protection, legal strategy, every formal thing a man can offer without exposing himself to refusal. He looked away toward the bare ewes. I am finished with that. She said nothing. She could hear crows in the far field and her own heartbeat, and the slight scrape of his glove against stone as he tightened his hand. I loved my wife, he said. I do not say that as obstacle or warning, only truth. When Marianne died, I built a life no one could accuse of neglect. Children tutored, tenants accounted, grief managed. I told myself that was honour. You showed me honour without warmth becomes another form of absence. His gaze met hers fully. I do not want to be absent from my own life any longer, and I do not want a future in which you are elsewhere. He drew a breath like a man stepping onto uncertain ice. Will you marry me, Barbara? Not from debt or gratitude or rescue. Because I love you, because I respect you, because when you're in a room, I find myself wanting to be a better man than habit permits. The world narrowed to his face, severe and open at once, and the impossible fact of hearing those words from him. Barbara could have answered yes at once. She had known, perhaps before he did, that her life had begun to bend toward his. But she had not fought this hard to become silent at the most important question of her life. If I marry you, she said, I do not dissolve into Greythorn. I do not become a graceful appendix to your title. You never could. I mean it seriously. So do I. She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar near his left temple she had noticed only in lamplight before. I want work, she said, not employment from need, work from choice. There are dozens of officers' daughters exactly where I was. Educated enough to know what is being done to them, too poor to stop it, dependent on relatives who call exploitation duty. I want a school, proper accounts, legal instruction, languages, mathematics, practical training for independence, endowed in my name and yours. If you ask me to marry you, you ask me as that woman. Julian's expression changed. Surprise first, then something fiercer and warmer. Admiration, yes. Recognition, deeper. I was going to ask what condition you would set, he said. I should have known it would involve reform of the social order before supper, preferably before luncheon. Done. Entirely done, he paused. May I add one condition of my own? Barbara lifted a brow. Audacious! You must permit me to love you badly at first, and better with practice. I have had too much practice at distance. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. I can permit that, if you permit me to be angry when necessary. I should be disappointed if you were not. A laugh escaped her, real, relieved, astonishingly light. In that case, yes. For one suspended second he simply looked at her, as if he had prepared for refusal and did not yet trust acceptance. Then he reached for her hand, not her bruised wrist now healed, but the hand itself, and brought it to his mouth. Thank you, he said against her knuckles, voice unsteady. Do not thank me yet, she said. You have not met the school committee I intend to assemble. I fear nothing after Ridley Assembly. That is because you have never chaired a board of determined women. He laughed again, and this time the laughter stayed, warming his whole face into something younger than sorrow had allowed. When he kissed her, it was not cautious. It was reverent and a little desperate, and entirely alive. From an upstairs window, two small faces vanished at speed, followed by Lady Eleanor's unmistakable triumphant clap. Barbara pulled back just enough to say, "We are being observed." "Good," Julian said. "Let them report accurately for once." In the spring, Barbara stood in a former dower house on Greythorn land, while carpenters hammered in the next room and argued cheerfully about lintel measurements. The signboard leaning against the hall wall read, "The Ivanov School for Officers' Daughters." Patron, the Earl and Countess of Greythorn. She still startled sometimes at the word Countess. It felt less like possession than platform. Mrs. Finch, promoted by universal consent to oversee domestic arrangements at the school 2 days per week, marched through carrying ledgers. If Miss Pratt from York sends another 3 girls without warning, we'll be putting cots in the music room. Then we shall compose very practical sonatas, Barbara said, taking the ledger. Across the hall, Lady Eleanor sat at a long table interviewing a prospective arithmetic mistress with the same expression she once reserved for unsuitable suitors. Hale, now honorary legal adviser, whether he liked it or not, sorted scholarship contracts and muttered that no one in this building respected pagination. Edmund and Alice, scrubbed and solemn for opening day, had been assigned to place slates on desks and were currently conducting a covert experiment involving marbles and an inkwell. Some battles were timeless. Julian entered from the courtyard with mud on his boots and 2 village fathers in tow, talking about roof drainage as if it were statecraft. He saw Barbara, excused himself, and crossed to her with the ease of a man no longer rationing tenderness. "First intake arrives in 20 minutes, he said. "Are you ready to terrify and inspire?" "In that order," she said. "Where is the portrait for the entry hall?" He held up a wrapped frame. Captain Ivanov, cleaned, rehung, and disapproving as requested. She touched the edge of the cloth-covered frame with 2 fingers. He was rarely disapproving. Then we shall tell the girls that too. A carriage rattled into the yard, then another. The first pupils came in pairs and trios, clutching satchels, eyes wide with that same wary hope Barbara remembered from mirrors. One curtsied too low. One forgot to curtsy at all and apologised in a tumble. One had a healing cut on her brow and tried to hide it under her fringe. "Come here," Barbara said gently, kneeling to the child's height. She took a clean, folded linen cloth from the washstand, pressed it lightly to the scrape, and smiled when the girl flinched less than expected. "There, nothing dramatic. You are safe." Her hands did not shake. Behind her the schoolroom filled with the sounds of benches scraping, papers rustling, girls testing new names on their tongues. Through the open door she could see Julian lifting a trunk one-handed while arguing amiably with a carpenter about bookshelves, Lady Eleanor directing traffic like a field marshal, and Alice whispering fiercely to a new student about the moral importance of commas. Once Barbara had stood in a different schoolroom gripping a table to keep herself upright, certain the world could be narrowed to what was done to her. Now, as she straightened with linen in one hand and attendance register in the other, she felt the full weight of a different ledger. Names entered not as debts, but as beginnings. "Good morning," she said to the room. Dozens of young faces turned toward her. "Let us begin."